Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Hush, hush, everyone. So I'm Dan Slater. I direct the Center for Emerging Democracies here at the International Institute. Very excited today to have this roundtable put together of four really diverse, eclectic set of really brilliant people who will be presenting from a variety of disciplines, a variety of perspectives on what I think is a really big question, which is the sort of the rise and the spread and the strengthening of authoritarian ideologies in the Americas. And when we say in the Americas, we mean not just South America. I think it's very clear authoritarian ideologies are also on the rise in North America as well. And I think it's also important, and we're trying to capture the fact here, that authoritarian ideologies don't always have their seeds in the political right. Sometimes they also have their roots in the political left. So we'll be talking about both North and South, both right and left, and hopefully be a really interesting set of interventions and conversations. So we're going to go in the alphabetical order. Let me just introduce everybody briefly. So Marilia Corrêa is an assistant professor of history at Baylor University. She was a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Emerging Democracies from 2019 to 2021. She specializes in modern Latin America and is currently working on a book manuscript examining the Brazilian military dictatorship, which was in power from 1964 to 1985, and its persecution of military officers and soldiers labeled as subversives. Ben Cowan, who unfortunately has COVID and could not join us in person, but is a person of incredible energy, and he will be sticking with us and will be presenting. He's a professor of history at UC San Diego. His first book, Securing Sex, Morality and Repression in the Making of the Cold War Brazil, was published by University of North Carolina Press in 2016. Securing Sex won 3 book awards, including the prestigious Brazil Section Book Award from the Latin American Studies Association. Dr. Cowan published a second monograph, Moral Majorities Across the Americas, Brazil, the United States, and the Creation of the Religious Right, also from UNC Press in 2021. Vincent Mauro is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Center for Emerging Democracies for 2023 to 2025. He studies comparative politics, in particular the politics of inequality and redistribution in democracies. His book project argues that democracy can certainly spark an impetus for redistribution, but representation, particularly in the developing world, is far from given, and redistributive outcomes across democracies are highly dependent on the development of party systems. And last but not least, Jen Triplett is a PhD candidate in sociology here at the University of Michigan. She's a qualitative comparative historical sociologist working in the subfields of political sociology, sociology of culture, gender, collective behavior and social movements, and international migration. Her dissertation examines how cultural constraints on projects of political articulation or mobilization change over time and are refracted through key events such as military, political, or economic crises. So very excited to get started here. Ben will join us second over Zoom, and Marilia will be joining us first. So everybody.
Thank you, Dan. Can you all hear me? No? Not working? It's on. Is it working now? Yes? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Dan, Derek, and the Center for Emerging Democracies for organizing this, allowing us to use the space and resources to come with this range of scholars to discuss authoritarianism in the Americas. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm excited about the next hour and a half. So I studied the Brazilian military dictatorship, and today I wanted us to discuss and my talk here, anti-communist ideology and how it provided military officers in Brazil with a rhetoric, a narrative to establish a military dictatorship in the country that lasted 21 years, right? And in my current book manuscript, I try to understand how their anti-communism operated inside the armed forces and how it was used to legitimize the expulsion of thousands of officers and soldiers from the institution between the 1960s and 1980s. So I look into persecution within the armed forces by military officers. In his scholarship, Professor Ben Cowan, which you'll hear from in a few minutes, has shown how military leaders in Brazil equated communism with what they considered morally depraved behavior. while he examined how this worldview shaped military leaders' portrayal of students, teachers, priests, artists, and other civilians, I consider how coup leaders questioned the manhood of their own colleagues in uniform, whom they labeled as communist. So anti-communist officers spoke as if the perceived communist activity of certain soldiers was also a deviation from a notion of the ideal soldier, which also had the ideal manhood, as if communism made them morally corrupted or lesser men. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Okay. Right. So to examine this perceived deviation, or how coup leaders deemed specific groups of servicemen were unworthy of the armed forces, I examined how the image of the ideal serviceman was constructed in Brazil during this era, post-World War II, right? So when young men joined the military during the post-war era, they received training in combat skills, but they were also taught norms of behavior and group identity. The military argued that these ideals would help soldiers develop what they called military spirit. So when military officers define servicemen that are full of military spirit, the terms discipline, hierarchy, honor, duty were some of the most used. When servicemen exerted certain qualities, behaved in specific ways, and demonstrated knowledge and loyalty to obeying military norms, their peers praised them for being filled with military spirit. Whenever a military officer was praised for being an outstanding representative of the military spirit, it was often because he valued discipline and his troops obeyed him. I wanted to bring an example of one of the sources I use, which is this manual. It's an Army manual of tactical instructions for the cavalry, and it's from 1953. And this document shows us how the institution tried to imbue into servicemen certain values, or try to teach them certain values, right? It's a 700-page document providing training parameters and tactical instructions to teach soldiers in war combat. But before doing that, before coming up with these specific instructions that range from terrain recognition to shooting equipment, the first 10 pages of the manual are dedicated to the morals of servicemen, in quotes. It asserts that a moral education was the basis of all military education and the most important aspect of military tactics. One quotation from that document was that teaching a serviceman to command troops is worthless if the sentiment of military and honor and duty is not engraved in his spirit beforehand. So this is I think it gets to a little bit of the core of what military spirit means. Patriotism, sacrifice, duty, trust, discipline are keywords in this document and portrayed as the targets of the moral education of soldiers. The good commander, this document claims, must work daily on the moral development of his horsemen. An analysis of these pages shows that the Army's strategy to train and transform young men into servicemen was to find a perfect balance between empowering them to believing in their own braveness and ability to engage in combat, while also making sure they would always adhere to the orders of their commanding officers. The development of what they call this military spirit also came imbued with notions of an ideal military masculinity, what I call military masculinity. So being brave, fighting in combat, protecting the homeland was a role for men, right? Not also soldiers, but for men. The same ideas that shaped military spirit, including duty and discipline, came along with notions of patriotism, braveness, and bodily strength, and were important components to the formation of this military masculine identity. So even though military officers and instruction manuals don't specifically mention gender and masculinity by name as they trained men to become disciplined and honorable, they push them to aspire to these ideals of a military manhood. If civilian men sought out to ambitions such as building a family, a career, economic means, property, right? In Brazil at that time, servicemen were taught to aspire to defend the fatherland. In the case of officers, these ambitions could be combined, right? And commanders could be with families to as they protected the fatherland. However, low-ranking soldiers in Brazil at that time, they weren't allowed to get married, for example, and they had to renounce the wish to form a family if they were to serve the military. While culturally, Brazilian men were expected to protect and provide for women and children, the homeland was supposed to be the family of servicemen that servicemen vouched to protect. And despite the limits of these ideals, right, since this image of the military hero, the ideal serviceman, was not always translated to reality, the armed forces did expect servicemen to commit to the ideals. Their time in military training, they're living in the barracks and serving together in the military bases and barracks. And the intensity of that experience made servicemen, most of the ones I researched, subscribed to these aspirations, right? However, and this I also look into my research, right? Subscription to this ideal of masculinity did not create political consensus in the armed forces. So in my research, I started noticing that servicemen across military branches and ranks, they believed the armed forces was an honorable institution and that servicemen needed to develop military spirit. However, while for some, those keywords that I was talking about, like discipline, duty, honor, while for some, those things push them to fight against communism, for others, it meant supporting the expansion of rights in Brazil, which made them communists in the eyes of anti-communist officers, right? So this generated a lot of conflict in this context, and anti-communist officers started accusing everyone that wanted to fight for rights in Brazil as communists. But accusations of communism were also heavily gendered, right? In the view of officers who supported and enforced the military coup of 1964 in Brazil, these communist soldiers also lacked this military spirit. So I wanted to also bring another example of this, right? Which is shows the case of Cândido da Costa Aragão, so in 1962, Navy, Marines, and sailors, they formed an association to fight for their rights. So such as career development, right? So they wanted an opportunity to rise in the military ranks in the Navy. They also wanted to get married. They wanted improvement in their living conditions and the relationship they had with their officers, superior officers. And Aragão, Cândido da Costa Aragão, was an officer, an admiral in the Navy who supported these soldiers. He supported their claim for these rights. He claimed that Marines and sailors could only reach the status of the quote, and I open this is a quotation, the perfect model of the Brazilian servicemen if the Navy addressed their social problems. And he was one of the very few, if not the only, Black soldier that started as a soldier and was able to reach the rank of admiral. And he understood that sailors and Marines arrived in the Navy having experienced situations of hunger and poverty, which meant that commanding officers must care for their material needs, right? So placing the interests of the nation before his own including to deal with the material needs of his troops. But many Navy officers, his colleagues, believed that Aragão's views were an insult to military hierarchy, right? Because they said that his support of these movements incited the troops to rebel. It led to indiscipline in the military. So this is a piece about a group of 28 of his colleagues in the Navy who wrote a manifesto against him. And for that, they were temporarily imprisoned in Brazil, right? It was a way to punish political, what they viewed as political insurrection in Brazil. This is a bit complicated because this is a picture of what's happening in 1963. Right after that, in 64, there's the military coup in Brazil. And these guys are actually the ones who support the military dictatorship. And Cândido Aragão is going to get persecuted after that. But this is, again, as a picture of what's happening in 63. This is a very interesting document. And right after they talk about this manifesto that they wrote against Aragão, the news piece brings a letter by one of the wives of one of these guys who wrote this manifesto, who signed this manifesto. And in this letter, the wife of one of them is defending or supporting her husband. And when she attacks Aragão as someone that shouldn't, and we'll talk about how the terms that she uses, right? But she attacks Aragão and talks about her husband and the other 27 officers as being honorable men, right? But for me, the way she does it is very interesting because it shows something about how Brazilian society and these narratives that were being that were in competition at this time. So she claims that with time, people would comprehend the difference between men with lowercase letter and men with uppercase letter, the last being those who have an honorable name that act with braveness, right? And this, again, this shows these competing narratives. So both in the wake of the military coup and throughout military rule, these anti-communist officers, like these 28 men here, and also their families, as we see in the case of his wife, they equated political subversion with a loss of manhood and a deviation from the ideal military masculinity. For the officers who conspired to take power in Brazil in 64, it was necessary to clean the armed forces from undesirable and dishonorable subversive soldiers who did not carry military spirit. And this is what they did, right? So this ideology, as my show was also gendered, prompted them to expel Cândido Aragão and over 6,500 officers and soldiers from the military ranks during the era of the dictatorship. And this is what I have from now, and we'll look forward for the Q&A for us to keep talking about this. Thank you.
Okay. I guess I'll just go ahead. First of all, thanks, Marilia, for that amazing presentation. I so enjoyed reading your work, and it's even better hearing you talk about it. I'm going to try and start my slideshow here. So you should just be seeing a blank screen right now, and someone can perhaps let me know if that's not the case. I think I can kind of see it behind there. In any case, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much for being here to discuss these ideas. Of course, thank you more than anything to Dan and to Marilia for the invitation.
Hey, I'm sorry, Ben, to interrupt, but we are just seeing a black screen right now.
Yeah, that's right. It's a blank slide. So
okay, it is a blank slide. Just wanting to check and make sure. I appreciate that. Thank you. Sorry to have interrupted.
No, thanks for checking. I would hate for my brilliant slideshow, as you will all see, it's really, a work of art to not be seen. So as I was saying, thanks to Dan and Marilia for the invitation, and to Derek for all the logistical work. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you all in person. As it turns out, despite the musings of some authoritarians, COVID is very real. So don't let anybody tell you different. So I thought I would open, actually, interestingly enough, with this. Some of you may know that Olavo de Carvalho, who you see pictured here, died last year in January due to complications from COVID-19. Carvalho, if you have never heard of him before, right, he was sort of considered to be the guru of the contemporary right in Brazil, a sort of Rasputin figure for President Jair Bolsonaro, and a sort of an icon of right-wing authoritarianists. Carvalho himself had long derided COVID as what he called mocorongavirus, which means something like the moron virus. And he said it was nothing more than a historinha de terror, right? A little like a nightmare story that had been cooked up by the left. So there he is in his final days. But this Instagram post is less interesting, I think, for the fact of Olavo himself than for its celebration of him, right? This is a post celebrating and mourning his death. And it was posted by a little-known group calling itself the Order of the Young Monarchists of Brazil. So, this is a group of children, right? Teenagers and children who advocate for monarchism, complete with all the trappings of neo-medievalism, including a sort of a penchant for banners and like royalty-style portraiture. They gather virtually and in person to talk about their hopes for the future, and especially for the reinstitution of Brazil's monarchy, which has been defunct since 1889. There's a lot of social media involved here. You can see some of their posts here, and they have all these sort of like chats and message boards full of messages like the ones you see there on the left, right? Ave Imperio, Gloria a Deus, right? And then that second one, which is a hashtag that's basically calling for Orleanist action, which means action in support of the defunct royal family. As you can see from the image there, they even claim Dumbledore himself for themselves. But on a serious note, this group and its guests, like other rightists in Brazil, agitate for several of the reversals of democracy that have marked the last decade or so. So they have celebrated the importance of monarchist participation in what they call the protest against the totalitarian government of Dilma Rousseff in 2013. As many of you know, Rousseff, who was the democratically elected president of Brazil, was removed by a judicial coup, or I should say a legislative coup in 2016. The monarchists refer to the MST, which is the movement of landless rural workers, as a terrorist group. They have recapitulated quite often their position that the founding of Brazil's republic in 1889 was a coup, right, to be mourned nationally not as the beginning, but as the end of Brazilian democracy. And, all this may, it's a little funny, right? It sounds kind of kooky and definitely extreme. But, while I don't think that the ex-royal family of Brazil is about to achieve its designs of a return to the throne, monarchism has, improbably enough, gained ground in recent years in Brazil in terms both of visibility and of adherence. And maybe more importantly, in terms of links with transnational reactionary, authoritarian, and traditionalist forces, this all reads to me as part of a long-term trajectory of the shifting coordination and constellation of reactionary, anti-modern authoritarianisms, both in Brazil and beyond it. So we're looking at what we might call a sort of a shifting terrain in which democracy and liberalism are openly defied, or their trappings are adopted by authoritarianists who claim to be the true democrats or the true povo or pueblo or people, right? Or at least the true representatives of those categories. So, of course, here are some familiar figures from that sort of transnational articulation. And, it's no secret that in the United States, this sort of feeling, if you want to call it that, this sort of movement towards authoritarianism is represented in at least one manifestation by Make America Great Again, associated, of course, with Trump, but also with his former advisor, Steve Bannon. In Brazil, one analog of this might be Make Brazil Great Again, which we saw in that photo of Olavo de Carvalho on his hat in his dying days. But perhaps a better translation of these sentiments is that voiced by the eldest member of the so-called royal family, Dom Luis, right? Self-styled Dom, which is an honorific, right? Who was the eldest member of the family for some time and thus the self-styled heir to the throne. This is a proclamation that he made during the very contentious celebration of Brazil's Independence Day in the last year of Bolsonaro's presidency. And the passages that I've highlighted translate to that phrase, Quero meu Brasil de volta, which means I want my Brazil back, right? He's celebrating the rallying cries of authoritarians and traditionalists who made that a sort of a slogan. And then he sort of finishes by identifying with those people, right? Saying, you know, monarchy has today, as it had yesterday, and as it will have tomorrow, all of the conditions to realize that which Brazil is called to be, right? A nation faithful to itself and in ascension, authentically Christian and monarchical. So, you know, according to monarchists themselves, but more convincingly based on journalistic and, you know, sociological investigations, what was a fragmented and sort of inchoate smattering of fantasists has lately grown better and, you know, more organized and more prominent. After taking part in those massive street protests in 2013, monarchist groups have continued to show themselves in the streets, first demonstrating against the left-wing government of Dilma Rousseff and then for the right-wing government of Jair Bolsonaro. And as you can see here, right, at the heart of this is this kind of a yearning for a mythical past, right, a literally fantasized past, as you can see in this kind of costumery, right, what is called a volta ao imperio, right, where a return to the empire, where the empire that is imagined here is not the literal empire of the 19th century in Brazil, but it's chimerical, right? It's more than anything, it's a reaction against the perceived ills of now, right? And anti-modernism that, like anti-modernisms before it, you know, it really represents the current moment in right-wing ideologies and political movements in the Americas, right? In that it is an authoritarian response to fear and anxiety about perceived changes, and concentrated in particular culture war issues. So I mentioned before the eldest of the Bragança family, Dom Luis, right? But he is, you know, far from the only Bragança to make these kinds of public pronouncements. In many ways, the ex-royal family itself is, you know, experiencing this kind of moment where it's seeing long years of carping and demanding a return to power finally paying off, right? Perhaps most visibly, there was a very real chance and quite a bit of support for the idea that Luis Felipe de Orleans y Bragança, who you see there, he's one of the scions of the defunct royal family. And there was a chance that he would be chosen as Bolsonaro's vice president in 2018. That did not happen. But, you know, this is the leader of the family's efforts at promoting their interests and their return to the so-called throne, which doesn't exist, whose self-styled Dom is the title that he gives himself, right? But this is Bertrand de Orleans y Bragança. So Bertrand and his branch of the family have been gaining more and more public visibility, and they've developed a kind of a growing warmth and closeness with the ruling powers of Brazil's government under Bolsonaro. So across social media, we've seen the proliferation of advertisements for the cause, you know, created by Bertrand or his relatives or their followers. Bertrand himself, as well as, you know, sundry other monarchist groups which have kind of proliferated, have, you know, each had social media followings in the hundreds of thousands. Among Dom Bertrand's first followers on Twitter was Eduardo Bolsonaro, who is the scandal-plagued and truly extreme son of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro. So again, all of this, it sounds kind of fringe. It may seem sort of surprising for any number of reasons, this idea of like a linkage between Bolsonaro and the monarchists. But it actually makes perfect sense given the theme that we're trying to address here today, because the current configuration of the right in Brazil, as elsewhere in the hemisphere, is premised upon the reinvigoration and unification of anti-modern extremisms that many people thought, were like moribund or long dead, but which are founded upon age-old notions of authoritarian hierarchy. So what monarchists and other formerly laughable political actors propose is something very much like a recapitulation of the reactionisms that we're all sort of used to seeing in the right wings that have stretched from the late Cold War to the current moment, with its Jair Bolsonaro's, its José Antonio Cast's, its Donald Trump's, its Nayib Bukele's, its Javier Milei's, to quote the most recent example, it's Jimmy Morales's, right? I could go on and on. But to put that in historical context, I've argued alongside other much more talented historians that there are clear through lines here, right? That the so-called, moral majorities that emerged and grew throughout the hemisphere in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that they always included a core of reaction that combined anti-communism with authoritarianism and a strong dose of ultra-traditionalist Christian chauvinism. And that today we are seeing this version of the new right, which can thus comfortably, at least from the inside, encompass, QAnon conspiracists alongside the pretendants to the Brazilian so-called throne, as well as other adherents of, mythic traditionalisms, from country music racial purists to the fiercest of neo-medievalists. Excuse me. Sorry about that. COVID. So all of these are exponents of traditionalist authoritarianism, right? Of the reimposition of hierarchies that are presented as both time-honored and natural, so to speak. So, to sort of schematize this, here's a little, a little slide to sort of schematize what we might mean when we're thinking about this new right. And there are many pieces here, of course, right? All bound up with reactions to what conservative authoritarianists perceive as the evils of modernity. And that sensibility, right, that anti-modern authoritarianism is really at the heart of my and other people's attempts to determine how this kind of a platform came together in Brazil as elsewhere in this, it's a cohesive, if not a coherent fashion. And that's especially true when we think about its empowerment, despite the apparent contradictions in this combination of, Christianity, but also moralism and cultural traditionalism with neoliberalism in theory and practice. Now, an important piece of that story, and I hope that we'll sort of flesh this out in our discussions today, is, transnational cooperation and less articulate forms of collaboration and communication in the formation of this kind of a platform. Those kinds of sort of communications and cooperations help to explain, for example, the idea that rural gun rights and opposition to abortion and the ridicule and dismissal of gender and sexual equality measures, denialism about COVID, denialism about the climate crisis, the dehumanization and murder of indigenous peoples, anti-communism, and unfettered, kind of vertiginous exploitation of natural resources, that all of those things which seem kind of disparate, that those could all go hand in hand, right? From Argentina all the way to Canada. So these are now interlocking elements in a right-wing platform that I think we can recognize in many places, but which is, at least sometimes most pronounced and most violent in Brazil. I've argued that Brazil formed one of several critical loci in the gestation and organization of the new right as a transnational phenomenon, and that is why, at least in part, Brazil and the United States have become eerily similar power centers of an authoritarian right, whose tenets are best summed up by the moniker that was given them in Brazil's national debates for some time, which is Bala, Bíblia e Boi, which means Bible, bullets, and beef. So what we're seeing, right, in Brazil as elsewhere, disparate factions have all come together to form a sort of peculiar blend of authoritarianisms. Culture war, neoliberal austerity, this kind of white supremacist resentment, disinformation, and a yearning for mythic pasts that form the core of right-wing populism's current brand. In the case of the monarchy, this meant monarchists' overwhelming support for Bolsonaro. And, you know, maybe a little more strikingly, what I mentioned before, which is this like real coziness between the ex-royal family and policymakers and the levers of government under Bolsonaro as president. So I'll just show a few examples of that kind of, you know, the recent activity of the ex-imperial family and their supporters cozying up to the now ex-government, right, the Bolsonaro government, you know, and kind of promoting monarchism and themselves as a sort of a branch or option or ally of the right-wing authoritarianism that Bolsonaro himself epitomized. So here they are with some, you know, high-ranking federal deputies. There was actually a monarchist caucus in the federal legislature, as sort of confusing as that sounds, right? And then, you know, here's Luis Felipe again, you know, promoting his book alongside Bolsonaro himself. I'll just show one other snap here from Dom Betran's Twitter, showing his flirtation with the fiercest proponents of one of Brazil's hot-button right-wing dreams, which is the liberalization of private citizens' access to firearms. And that is an initiative that is designed to protect white male landowners from supposed threats to their supremacy. Here, oh, that's just a charming gun club in Brazil. Here we have another scion of the royal family, right? Rafael, who's a nephew, right? Declaring his support for Bolsonaro and for a return to monarchy and authoritarianism generally, in that way of sort of like adopting the trappings, let's say, of democratic liberalism, right? And this is a kind of a common trope among authoritarianists in Brazil, right? Saying that they are the true representatives of, you know, the povo, or here that monarchy actually is the more representative, right? More democratic system. So, you know, broadly what we're looking at, from, you know, royals to self-described Brazilian rednecks, to use the name of that gun club, right, is, you know, these right-wingers making common cause around this renovated new right? The idea that a restoration is possible, not only in terms of authoritarian politics, you know, the monarchy itself, but in terms of a restoration of patriarchy, right? Of freedoms to engage in violence, right? The physical violence of shooting, but also the social and psychological violence that travels along traditional axes of morality, of gender, of sexuality, of race, and of religion. You know, truth be told, right, a majority of right-wing officials and Bolsonaristas in the government of the last 4 years, you know, they share the agenda of monarchists because that agenda has been built across decades of right-wing activism and agitation and coalition building. And that's why monarchists and other sort of fringe elements in Brazil have found themselves suddenly in the position of you know, supporting the powers that are. They share that sudden welcoming into the fold with other far-right groups, even integralists, who some of you may know are the long-defunct Brazilian fascists, who, as my colleague, the historian Leandro Pereira Gonçalves, has brilliantly demonstrated, you know, they never really disappeared, they just fractured, but they've been also experiencing a kind of a resurgence. And that unfracturing of the political right, even the extreme political right, has contributed to the rise of political violence, right? There are lots of ways of documenting this, from hate crime to, you know, street violence. But, you know, the figures that you see in the center of this slide, you know, they claim to be from an integralist group when they bombed, you know, a TV station in Rio in 2019. And the truth is that all of these groups they share an orientation that was shaped by more than a century of right-wing anti-democratic agitation, right? And that intensified in the last decades of the Cold War via specific strategies of authoritarianism that sought to unite anti-communism, hyper-capitalism, and culture war. So Dom Bertrand and the Bolsonaris and the fascists, they all can quite easily agree on opposition to gay marriage, on ending protections for racial and ethnic minorities, especially indigenous people, on the prohibition of abortion under any circumstances, on direct support for anti-democratic authoritarianism in many forms, on support for arming the white and male and privileged elements of the population, on the primacy of private property in the hands of a few, and on denialism of climate change, of COVID, and other science-based issues. And that is how we get to this kind of incongruity, right? The monarchist Dom Bertrand, right, claiming the Republican president Bolsonaro as an ally, right? Because the latter's authoritarian extremism seems like, and is really, an approximation of the reactionary monarchism that Bertrand wants for Brazil and the world. Now, I imagine I've already gone over my time, so I'll just end with a slide that shows Dom Bertrand's kind of epitomization of the new right's boldness and its articulation of authoritarianism as a kind of declared and frankly organicist schematic for human society, right? This is Dom Bertrand writing about, the ideal society, right, in one of his books, right? And he talks about how, the beauty of society is not inequality, right? It isn't, democracy and egalitarian democracy are not the ideals, right? But instead, hierarchicalized society, right, just like a symphony, is what one is aiming for, right? And in that, he is fully consistent with the rest of the authoritarianists that we've seen and talked about in the last few minutes. And I will leave it there for the moment and hope to talk more in the Q&A.
Is the volume all right? Yeah? Okay. Oh, I don't get to see what's going on here. Is there any way I can see the slide? Thanks. It's all right then. It's the second one. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, so I was already introduced, so I'm gonna spare the breath. My name is Vincent Mauro. Why does it keep flicking? I'm going to present on anti-redistributive ideology and authoritarianism in Latin America. So about 2 weeks ago, it was the 50th anniversary of the 1973 Chilean coup. So I thought I would at least mention it. The Chilean military intervened against a democratically elected president, Allende, who was implementing a quite radical social and economic agenda. But this was not the first time the Chilean military intervened. We good? Okay, it was not the first time the Chilean military intervened in democratic politics. So in the early 1920s, a man named Alessandri was elected president on a kind of a reformist, a populist, if you will, platform. But his kind of social and economic reforms were blocked by a very conservative Congress. And without kind of getting into the details, some young officers in protest of this blocking kind of went into Congress and rattled their sabers in protest of kind of them blocking this agenda. And eventually Alessandri resigned and the military took over. And it was kind of a very abrupt end to Chileans' arguably first democratic experiment. There's a long line of literature that would say, Vincent, those are totally typical cases. Those are exactly what we would argue would happen in very unequal democracies. And the basic kind of the very simplistic framework is elites have a natural trepidation towards democracy because the masses can use their votes to soak the rich. In unequal democracies, the masses far outnumber elites, and they can use this numerical advantage to kind of elect redistributivist politicians that then kind of tax or expropriate the rich. So the basic implication is democracy is very difficult in environments of high inequality due to incentives for elites to pull trigger on democracy to prevent redistribution. There's a lot of us that really love this idea, this theory, for its parsimony, for its kind of logical consistency, but we've had a pretty hard time finding actual evidence to support it. There's a very uneven empirical record between inequality, structural inequalities, and democratic breakdown. Dan Slater and some colleagues found that post-colonial democracies that redistribute more are less likely to break down, contrary to expectations. Haggard and Kaufman found that most of kind of the episodes of democratic breakdowns didn't necessarily have kind of redistributive struggles kind of at their core. And Ansel and Samuels have done a kind of a bevy of quantitative tests and find little evidence of a relationship between kind of inequality and poor democracy or democratic breakdown. My contribution here isn't to kind of dive really deeply into this empirical but important kind of debate. I think that these kind of ideas in this theory has a lot of value. We just might be looking in perhaps the wrong place. And the basic argument of kind of this project, very simply, is elites don't fear democracy, and they don't necessarily even fear unequal democracies. There's so many ways to kind of bake in institutions to prevent the actual redistribution of their wealth. What they fear the most are credible redistributive threats. And the basic argument is that these credible redistributive threats are most likely to come in the form of a political party. Why? For two reasons. One, parties are powerful institutions for coalition building and constructing redistributive in this case identities. They stitch together very varied economic and social groups. They solve the collective action problem that happens in a lot of democracies where kind of the poor or the working class don't always vote together. But perhaps most importantly, political parties are uniquely capable of capturing formal political institutions and power. Redistribution by nature is anti-status quo. It kind of runs against the grain. You need political power to implement redistribution, which necessarily means you must have either the legislature and or the presidency. In most modern democracies, these institutions in order to capture them, you need a political party. No, the argument here isn't that all political parties are redistributivist. That's just not the case. Some are very anti-redistributivist. The argument is simply that if there's going to be a credible redistributive threat in democracy, it's most likely to come in the form of a political party. Some have argued all that really matters for democratic stability is that economic elites feel secure. Whether you agree with that or not, the basic argument here is that all democracies to some degree rest on a foundation of economic and political elites cooperating with each other. And when threatened, a ruling coalition between economic and political elites are more likely to engage in undemocratic behavior to undermine that redistributive threat. They both have kind of similar interests. In this case, economic elites want to preserve their kind of wealth and resources. Political elites want to remain the kind of dominant faction in the political system. So how does this act? When the nuts and bolts of what goes on? Essentially, Usually the first step is elites will begin to utilize institutions in questionably democratic or undemocratic ways to prevent a redistributive threat from gaining power. So this could be a number of things, but for example, kind of changing the electoral rules of the game to kind of tilt the balance of power against a redistributive threat. This doesn't necessarily obviously lead to democratic breakdown per se, or a clear episode of breakdown, but it definitely weakens it. When redistributive threats do win elections, elites may decide to actively remove them from power, leading to democratic breakdown. In this case, obviously, if you remove a democratically elected leader or a party, this is obviously a pretty clear case of democratic breakdown. In other cases, the redistributive threat itself can engage in authoritarian behavior, and it can be the one to pull the trigger on democracy, preemptively strike against elites, or kind of use their power to demolish democracy in order to consolidate their own power. This isn't kind of a static theory where elites just respond to redistributive threats. There's kind of a tit for tat, a dynamic relationship between these kind of different actors. So in the interest of the kind of roundtable experience, I didn't want to go too deeply into the empirics, but I just thought I'd just kind of highlight a few things. And if you want to talk about this after, privately or in the roundtable, that's fine. I use deviant and extreme cases of Argentina and Brazil to theory build. Argentina is interesting, one of the most equal countries in Latin America, but a lot of cases of democratic breakdown, which seems to be at least partially a function of Peronism and a conflict between that. Brazil, most unequal democracy in Latin America, or country in Latin America. Only one clear episode of democratic breakdown, at least how we traditionally code it. I've staged survey experiments on economic elites in Brazil. There's one in the field in Argentina. The basic idea is to really understand if we get elites thinking about redistributive threats, does it change their perceptions of democracy? And the results in Brazil suggest that just thinking about the PT and redistributive lens, how it makes them have more negative views of democracy. And you can kind of just code the kind of episodes of redistributive threats coming into the political system, whether they existed or not, and see if there's a relationship with democratic breakdown. There is, or coups. So just to kind of conclude, inequality may indeed drive episodes of democratic breakdown, but I don't think it's necessarily the structural inequality that is causing this, or elites' fear of democracy. Rather, acute threats of redistribution, particularly the emergence of political parties espousing redistributive ideologies, may be what conditions the probability of this democratic breakdown. Thanks.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Dan and Derek for organizing this panel, to my co-panelists and all of you for being here today. I'm going to bring the conversation north a bit, about 90 miles south of Florida. Today, I'm going to be talking about the rise and fall of hegemonic rule in Cuba since the revolutionary regime that came to power in 1959. Great. The recent COVID-era protests in Cuba were the first of their kind in several decades. Compared to other collective public displays of dissent during this period, there were more protesters in more cities who were met with more state repression. I'll give it a second. That's all right. Fantastic. So more protesters in more cities with more state repression. Of course, there were new grievances. Many deemed the chaos and material hardship brought on by the pandemic to be worse than the economic catastrophe of the 1990s following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But as social movement scholars have demonstrated, grievances only tell part of the story. I would argue that the rise in COVID-related grievances was accompanied by a sharp decline in the average Cuban's consent to be ruled by the regime that came to power more than 65 years ago. This decline, stemming from the erosion of the regime's hegemonic power, is evident in the protesters' demands for freedom and better governance, alongside their calls for food, medicine, and fuel. With the people's consent receding, leaders have increasingly turned to violent repression to manage dissent. What this argument implies is that the Cuban revolutionary regime has not always relied principally on indiscriminate public repression as its main means of managing dissent and discontent. In the remainder of my time, I'll make two key points. First, I'll demonstrate how, upon seizing power, the Cuban revolutionary regime set out to build consensus and consent among the public, creating a basis for their hegemonic rule. They did so in part by creating a universal revolutionary identity to unite the people and garner support. Second, I'll show that in recent years, regime leaders have switched tact to open and violent repression of dissent, and I'll argue that this transition stems in part from the public's feelings of alienation and their withdrawal of consent to be ruled. The regime's most prominent strategy for dealing with dissent during its first decade in power was simply to avoid it altogether. Leaders sought to foster unity, unanimity, buy-in, and consensus that would allow them to rule via hegemony. And I use the term hegemony as conceptualized by theorist Antonio Gramsci to mean the idea that the ruling class embeds itself throughout society primarily via intellectual and moral leadership rather than threat or force. Establishing and maintaining hegemony involves transforming how people see the world and their attitudes, beliefs, and ways of interacting with each other. Thus, hegemony requires creating new subjects, which leaders accomplish using their monopoly of cultural and ideological power. In the Cuban case, leaders did this by constructing a universal revolutionary identity known as the Pueblo Cubano, essentially the Cuban version of the United States' We the People. Using discourse, policies, and practices, leaders defined the Pueblo Cubano as the embodiment of a form of social solidarity that was rooted in mass participation. Through political and economic participation, the Cuban citizenry became enmeshed in the Pueblo Cubano, giving their energies and consent to the new ruling elite. For example, becoming a revolutionary subject meant contributing to national economic growth. Revolutionary media drew a direct line from people's participation in the economic sphere to economic sovereignty. A 1961 article from Mujeres, which was a nationalized magazine for women, explained that, quote, "It is in the economic field where imperialism gives us the strongest fight, which to win, we need the maximum effort of every Cuban." And here's a photo from Mujeres depicting some women giving this maximum effort to contribute to agricultural production. In addition to this forward-looking and militaristic framing, leaders also promoted economic participation through examples of what not to do. In this way, regime discourse juxtaposed the good, productive Cubans of the revolutionary present against the bad, parasitic anti-Cubans of the Republican era. For instance, Castro contrasted the ideal revolutionary worker against the idle exploiters of the past, like politicians, henchmen, and landowners. Regime efforts to secure citizens' consent for their rule via constructing a participatory universal revolutionary identity seemed to pay off, as reflected in statistics regarding mass participation at that time. Membership in the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, the CDR, which were block-level organizations designed to mobilize support at the grassroots, increased from around 800,000 in 1961 to 4.8 million by 1976. Not all members were equally participatory, of course, but CDR members accounted for 16.7 million hours of volunteer labor in 1969, and over 64% of members from CDR committees participated in political study groups in 1973. So politicization and productivity defined membership in the Pueblo Cubano and solidified citizens' support of the regime. But it is important to acknowledge that the regime's pursuit of hegemonic rule is only part of the story. And alongside this meticulously crafted hegemonic worldview and way of life, leaders developed a carefully constructed coercive apparatus. They eliminated political enemies by imprisoning, exiling, or even executing them, and they also used coercion to enforce citizens' discipline and obedience. Perhaps the best-known manifestation of these were the military units to aid production, the UMAP, a euphemistic term given to the forced labor camps that Castro established in 1965. In them, an estimated 35,000 individuals were forced to do difficult manual labor with the purported goal of re-educating them and helping them to comply with the expectations of revolutionary subjecthood. On the balance, throughout the 1960s, regime leaders prioritized solidarity building and subject formation as a way to establish and maintain rule through hegemony. At the same time, they didn't hesitate to use force when they deemed it necessary. But without diminishing the negative impact that the regime's use of repression had on individuals and their families, existing literature suggests that leaders tended not to rely on public displays of indiscriminate violence to secure citizens' consent to be ruled. Fast forwarding just a bit here to July 11th, 2021, when thousands of Cubans took to the street to voice discontent with material conditions, disapproval of the governing elite, and disillusionment with the violation of their civil rights. What started as an isolated incident in San Antonio de los Baños, a small town about an hour southwest of Havana, quickly spread to towns across the island, often with the aid of social media. As I noted earlier, the protesters were notable for the sheer number of demonstrators, but it's also important to consider who these protesters were. Observers noted that all social classes, artists, university students, small business owners, low-level state employees, etc., were all represented at the gatherings. The diverse protesters also represented a broad array of grievances. Despite state-controlled media portraying them as counter-revolutionaries determined to overthrow the government, few openly made that demand. Rather, they called for material relief and the respect of their civil rights. People were tired of blackouts, mile-long lines for fuel, and empty shelves at the pharmacies and grocery stores. But they were also tired of the state's denial of citizens' rights to free expression and peaceful assembly. Rather than engage peacefully with the protesters, leaders chose to respond with broad and indiscriminate violence. President Miguel Díaz-Canel encouraged party loyalists to counter protesters' activity, which incited citizens' violence against each other, while police issued massive arrests, often brutally handling detainees. Officers arrested minors, the elderly, and people who did nothing more than film the unfolding events on their cell phones. Finally, many detainees were denied legal rights and representation and sentenced to prison terms disproportionately long for their alleged offenses. Backlash against the government's handling of the protests was swift and loud, especially from families of victims of police brutality and harsh sentencing. Across social media, Cubans expressed their dismay over leaders' reactions to the protests and their approach to governance more broadly, evincing deep feelings of resentment and alienation. The protests galvanized many Cubans who continued demanding a more responsive government. As the wife of one man who was arrested during the protests said, "I'm not afraid. They have made me stronger." And wrapping up, I do want to be clear about a few things. I'm not suggesting that consent is equivalent to submissiveness. Cuban people have engaged in smaller acts of daily resistance in a variety of ways for decades. I'm also not claiming that the regime has only resorted to violence in the past 3 years. In addition to the more egregious cases like the UMAP camps that I mentioned, the Cuban state has long combated these smaller acts of daily resistance with more subtle forms of repression. Rather, what I am saying is that this is a story about the collapse of hegemonic rule, which is contingent on the consent of the people, and which the regime had very carefully constructed since its earliest days in power. Now, I can't predict the future, and I'm unsure whether the damage done to the relationship between the state and the body politic is irreparable, but I suspect that it might be. Thank you.
Q&A, you guys want to head up to the front? Thanks for those great presentations. I thought those spoke really, really well to each other. Let's bring Ben back up on the screen. And people want to start thinking about formulating a question in the time that we have. I wanted to start with a question about, so one word that wasn't spoken in the past hour at all is Venezuela. And one reason I bring up Venezuela is to think about, it does seem to me to be, inspiring a lot of the whether it's anti-redistributivist, and to use Vincent's terms, or kind of anti-communist ideology that we're seeing, anti-socialist ideology that we're seeing spread throughout the Americas, as we heard in Ben and in Marilia's talk. And I just wonder if that might be something worth bringing. How does that maybe influence the way we think about some of these issues? That is the specter of what's happened in Venezuela, that kind of breakdown and conditions of Venezuela kind of fueled a lot of this anti-authoritarianism, or could we imagine having those effects? And this is in the United States as well. I think it's one way to understand the results in the Florida in the presidential election and the support of DeSantis is the strength of kind of anti-socialist views, and the view that basically, and the view certainly of a lot of Venezuelan migrants and from other parts of Latin America who kind of look at to them, authoritarian ideology in the Americas means socialism. That's what the authoritarian ideology is. So I wonder if that is something we should be, if we bring it in the conversation, how does it change the conversation? If anybody wants to speak to that.
I mean, I can give it a stab.
I can give it a stab after as well.
That, it definitely is playing a huge role in Brazil. I mean, differently than in the United States, right? But of course, as all of you know, right, Brazil shares a border with Venezuela, right? And the idea of, a sort of sensible Brazil led by Bolsonaro being surrounded by these authoritarian left-wing governments has been a huge part of the mythos of the Bolsonaro regime, right? Has, been something that he himself has drawn upon amply, as have these other sort of fringe elements of the right that have come together to support his form of authoritarianism. And I think what's really most important about that for our purposes, right, is it's not just a critique of what has actually happened in Venezuela, right? It's a combination of the truths of hardship, mismanagement, authoritarianism in Venezuela, with the idea that any government that does not subscribe to a sort of Trumpist or Bolsonarist agenda, right, is in the same boat, right? So that, to get back to the question, right, that's how we see that playing a role in Florida, right? The idea that a vote for Joe Biden is the same as a vote for, Venezuelan style authoritarian socialism. And that is the same sort of script that is played out in Brazil, along with the sort of the linkage again of the xenophobia, right? So if in the United States we're talking about build the wall, in Brazil, there isn't really an immigration crisis, right? But for almost a decade now, there have been these attempts to create Bolivians or Venezuelans as the specter of that kind of a crisis, and to combine it with this idea of painting any kind of non-traditionalist, non-right-wing authoritarian government as the actual authoritarianism. So again, the adoption of, we're the real Democrats, right? We're the real people defending democracy, really obviously playing into the narratives about Venezuela.
Take a
Sure. So throughout history, and this is certainly the case in Latin America, it's certainly the case in other areas as well, is there's often been these kind of very acute episodes, or very scary, acute episodes that become kind of a model in people's heuristics. So the Cuban Revolution was definitely one. It kind of sparked, it's whoa, look at what happened in Cuba. We don't want that happening in our country. And it can also spark backlashes or responses that might be disproportionate to what's going on in their own countries, right? Brazil, Chile, Argentina, boom, 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 coups in a row, in part because they were afraid of kind of these communist threats, revolutions. And Venezuela seems to be one of the contemporary examples. And I know for a fact that it has that same visceral kind of acuteness to it. And everyone can see how Venezuelan societal collapse was just so dramatic. This was once one of the most richest countries in Latin America, and definitely in the developing world, and now is reduced to one of the poorest countries in the region. And so that's gonna be a model in people's heuristics, and the way that they respond to that is often kind of disproportionate to what might be happening in their own kind of environments or countries.
Anybody in the audience like to?
Thanks. This question is for Vincent, but others can feel free to respond. And the question is, how well do you think your theory travels north to the US? And I'll just say a couple of thoughts that were motivating this. One is that perhaps national Republicans are worried about Democrats coming to power and, implementing a more progressive tax rate. But should we really code that as a redistributivist threat? And then also, so much of backsliding in the US has occurred at the subnational level, and so many of these subnational races aren't competitive. So what do subnational Republicans really feel threatened by? So just an invitation to speak about redistributivist threats in the US.
Sure. Do I think it travels well to the case of the US? Not exceptionally. It depends. So one of the things I didn't talk about in the talk is it's not necessarily just redistributivist, kind of very simply things that matter. Populism matters as well. And, often, left forms of populism take up a redistributive kind of ideology as well. So there's kind of some mixing in there. But the reason why I don't think it travels, at least to contemporary US right now, is I don't think there's a true redistributive threat in the US, whether it's the Democrats or if MAGA has some working class elements, and I think that's something that's growing over time, but it's certainly not like the core of the ideology. There are many, so I don't want to be too absolutist that, all forms of backsliding, all democratic breakdowns are caused by kind of this like dynamic. There could be multiple causes, but the US also, the institutions that were put in place many centuries ago are very clearly baked in to prevent kind of these majoritarian redistributive threats. So it like institutionally, it's very kind of guarded against that. It could happen in the future, but at least right now, I don't think it's driving authoritarianism in the US. Yeah.
Thank you. Those were really fantastic presentations and spoke really well across. And I guess my question is also a follow-up to Adam's. And Ben and Vincent sort of spoke to different ends of the spectrum. And my question was also on redistribution and recognition as one of when your presentation did a nice job of talking about the kind of the identity, where the building up and the creation of identity as a base, what was in some ways powering these, what are no longer kind of extreme or just fringe elements, but are really sort of reshaping almost institutionally, whether it's party mobilization, etc. And for Vincent, that was sort of missing, I felt, in what you're doing. And I was curious my question to you really is, what is the role of identity as the other side of the equation, really, and the role that plays in sort of, again, and to what extent is the redistributive threat? What is a non-real redistributive threat? And if you could clarify that, because mobilization without a party could be one, but maybe if you could say a little bit more to kind of ground your claims.
I don't want to be hegemonic in the Q&A here. I think identity is important. So it really depends on what we unpack identity and what that means in your question to you. I think identity for me is in that part. So there was two reasons political parties are like, the kind of core like redistributive threat or most likely form of it is because they can stitch together people around a shared common ideology and identity that is often very difficult outside of the realm of a party in a democracy. And that doesn't mean that there can't be some identity or ideology in a social movement, interest groups. The problem is that they're so often so ephemeral, and like they can't capture institutions, that they often are much weaker than a political party, or not necessarily weaker, but they're much less credible of a threat to elites or the ruling coalition. So identity matters. I think working class identity could matter. I think, racial, ethnicity, identity, depending on how it melds together with redistribution and those types of ideologies, I think it could matter in a number of different dimensions, but it's the political party able to kind of fuse a collective identity around redistribution and a certain set of social groups that is kind of doing a lot of work in kind of the argument.
I mean, we do see that in the Cuban case. So thinking about like a very real, non-unreal redistributive threat in the agrarian reform that was going on starting in May of 1959. So about 5 months after the Cuban revolutionary regime took over, before you could probably even call it a regime proper. Like it's still a kind of loose coalition of anti-Batista leadership that came to power. And so in that redistributive threat, on the one hand, it was explicitly material. We are trying to take lands from these people and give them to other people. But it also was glorification of the peasant identity at that moment, the elevation of the status of the peasant, and how their imposed and inherent qualities like self-sacrifice and patriotism and the role they played in Cuban independence at the end of the 19th century was being elevated and glorified in such a sense that the elites at that moment would have felt, I would imagine, we're not only about to lose who we have, but also what we are. So I think they do go hand in hand, absolutely, these projects.
Yeah, thank you all for these presentations. I have a question for Marilia. I really liked your presentation, and I've done some work actually on like institutional anti-communist sort of transnational networks of surveillance and things like that, but much earlier back, in the 20s and 30s. And I think, so my question is a little bit motivated from that. I'm curious what you think about so one of the things that I thought was interesting was this twin threat of communism as a threat to like patriarchal norms and things like that. I'm also wondering what kind of links you think that has to do with defining national identity and nationalism. And do you can you talk a little bit more about how that maybe do you see any through lines to like the populism that eventually emerges out of that? Like what are the sort of connections to those kinds of trends? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, can't hear anything. It's confusing. Thank you for that. Yeah, so this it was the project of the military who took power in Brazil in '64, right? Was a hegemonic power, to use a language to construct. They had a project for the nation that was very conservative. It was very connected to what Ben, I think, was saying with in Brazil, we see a lot of continuity, especially in these conservative elitist projects, right? And the connections with the monarchy, right? That's why you have the military with these connections. And there was a project to construct a nation that was very conservative. It was very grounded on what I say here in the military, that it was that there was an ideal notion of what it meant to be a man, right? But these and Ben himself works a lot better, works with this a lot better than I do, and how that translated to society, right? How this military or the project that is that is formed, created, rationalized inside the military, how that exerted in society, and how if inside the military you have this ideal notion of manhood for military men, you also have this notion for civilians, right? When you think about when you ask about populism, do you mean the connections of that history with recent politics, or do you mean the populism of perhaps the military dictatorship? Or
that's similar thread in terms of projecting a certain type of national image or national identity.
Right. I'd have to think a little bit more about that, but I see these connections with, you know, this creation of a project for the nation, and how it has gendered connotations, right? Specifically about also what it means to be a woman, right? What the Brazilian woman should look, behave like, and everything. But I specifically, in my research, I look about the men, right? So it's how it's views about masculinity, but for sure it's a national project, right? It is a nation building. So they're trying to construct something in terms of the nation state. Yeah, I hope this answers.
Hi, I have a question for Ben. In your talk, you spoke about the monarchistas and the integralistas. And I was wondering to what extent the military is also engaged with these right-wing movements, and Maria might also want to comment on that, because we're seeing in many other countries the military either taking over, as in a number of African countries, but also increasingly visible in governments that are they've either tipped over into authoritarianism or they're going in that direction. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the role of the military in Brazil.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I'm sure that Marilia will also have quite a bit to say about this. You know, the sort of increasing participation, if you want to call it that, of the Brazilian military in the sort of halls of power under Bolsonaro's government was cause for a lot of concern among, you know, the supporters of Brazilian democracy. And there is no shortage of evidence that the kinds of ideas that we've been talking about today have made really significant inroads in Brazil's military, you know, across the sort of historical spectrum that we're dealing with, but also in very recent years. And so, you know, the idea of, you know, thinking about a sort of transnational articulation of authoritarian calls for a return to traditional culture, however you want to conceive of that, and the sort of unique case of Brazil's military. I mean, it is kind of an alarming powder keg, right? Because there's a history of authoritarianism, of course, right? But there's also now a sort of linkage with broader ideas that, you know, that think about policing and security states as the only real way of guaranteeing, you know, authentic democracy, right? So, for example, in Brazil, there's been a sort of a glorification, not just of the military itself, but of militarization. And by that, I mean the kind of glamorizing of authoritarian and anti-democratic police forces, right? Which means that while violence, like particularly against Afro-Brazilians, has gone off the charts, and the killings of civilians by police, both military and civilian police in Brazil, have really, you know, skyrocketed in recent years, there's a retrenchment among, you know, Bolsonaristas and other authoritarianists, and a sort of, let's call it like a Brazilian analog of the Blue Lives Matter kind of rallying cry, right? So at various levels, right, from the direct involvement of, you know, of military members, high-ranking members of the military and government, to a kind of celebration of militarism and of the security state, there's a way that this sort of resurgence of authoritarianism has really had a very real impact on the structures of power in Brazil. Marilia, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot we can say about that, right? So, but so the Brazilian military dictatorship officially ended in 1985. the military, so that there have been processes in Chile and Argentina, for example, to prosecute some of these torturers and agents of the dictatorships. In Brazil, that was never the case. They were never prosecuted. So there was the transitional justice process in Brazil was very complicated because the military continued in positions of power. First, they continued with the hold of the military itself, the institution. It was not, perhaps there was no transition of people who did not support and enforce the military dictatorship. So those people, they were still the same. And when you think about the person and think about this anecdotally, in the person of Jair Bolsonaro himself, right? He was a captain in the military. I think he went to the military reserves or something, like 30 years ago. He became a member of Congress, and he also always positioned himself as pro-dictatorship. There's several interviews with him in the 1990s where he says that he thinks the dictatorship in Brazil should have killed more people, it didn't eliminate all the communists, so it should have been harsher, right? And then after 28 years of being an apologist of the military dictatorship, he runs for election for presidential office and wins. Right. So it's and I see this moment as kind of a moment where this narrative of apologists of the dictatorship comes to gains huge popularity, right? Because it's that guy who comes and then people start digging up these interviews and everything. So and during his government, they're actually most of the ministers he put into his government, they are military, right? So there are a return of the military who were kind of hidden in some positions that they were able to get in. They come back to Brasilia and the ministries and all of that. So the influence of the military in Brazil throughout, from 64 to at least last year, but this continues, right? Because Bolsonaro got out, but there are a bunch of structures in place that, for example, the amnesty, right? The Brazilian government continues giving amnesty to these military authoritarian agents and so forth. And I'll stop here, but yeah, that's
if I can just add one more thing to what Marilia said, right? I mean, it's not just Bolsonaro celebrating the dictatorship. Brazil is actually at the forefront of something I think we see in other authoritarian contexts now, which is an overt and really coordinated attempt to rewrite history. For years, partisans of the dictatorship would say things like, oh, well, we won the war against the communists, meaning we killed a lot of people, but we lost the peace, which meant, the story hasn't been told in the right way. And there have been, massive, very well-funded efforts now to reorient that story around celebrating the military dictatorship and making that the actual popular narrative.
Right. Well, I think these are clearly issues that aren't going anywhere, and I think we've just kind of scratched the surface. I think these tend to be strengthening a lot of these ideological movements across the Americas. We didn't even get to El Salvador or Nicaragua, or you could just go on and on. So a lot to talk about, and it's really great, all four of you, to bring your insights to this. I want to thank Derek Groom for his logistical support for everything, and our whole technical crew. This was especially challenging with our mix of Zoom and screens and presentations, so it was marvelous. But most of all, thank everybody for coming, and thank our four panelists, Ben Cowan, Jen Triplett, Vincent Mauro, and Marilia Corrêa. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone.